Hello, this is Mugwort doing a recording of round 2 of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. And my opponent is doooovid. We're just about to start. Again, I will try to best to represent my thoughts at the time of the match. It's recorded approximately 12 hours after the match on the 15th of April. So starting the first game with the black pieces, playing the French defense. And my idea with black was to mix it up a bit and play something different in every game. I have nothing specific prepared here. Just typically like to bring the knight to f5 as quickly as possible. Prepared to meet bishop g5 with a quick h6, maybe even g5. But otherwise, nothing fancy. Bring the knight to f5, other knight to c6. And we'll wait to see how doooovid chooses to develop. Knights before bishops. So expecting bishop b5, and can either play bishop e7 or bishop d7. Either are okay. You notice it's a little bit late for white to play bishop d3 because the d4 pawn will hang. So I'm okay with the trade because then I can stick the bishop perhaps back on h5 and then cover my king side a little more. Perhaps provoking the bishop to make a decision with a6 is okay. Otherwise, I think the move in the game is just bishop e7 and intending to castle and play f6, try and trade off white's e5 pawn. So white has to be a bit careful here not to underdefend his bishop, which he's done. Because I can pick off a pawn with knight takes e5. I'm not sure why I'm hesitating. I'm actually calculating the knight sack that ensues on f7. And because doooovid has lost a pawn, I think he made the right choice in the game to complicate by sacking the knight on f7 after knight takes e5. Because any other choice black is just a safe pawn up and can choose to put it back to defend the king side or put it back on e4 to attack. Yeah, and castling is certainly totally fine if it's allowable, because obviously white doesn't have a pawn to put on h6, and the knight on f5 often does a good job stopping white's attack on h6. So yeah, anticipating the sack on f7. Thought he would drop the knight back immediately. Quickly looking at king g8. Sometimes you try to make your opponent waste a pawn on f7 and then go king f8, try and chase away the knight on e5, and you end up winning the pawn back on f7. But I thought if white could trade off the knight on f5, then I'm not really sure whether I want the king on g8. So it's a good move, knight g3. And I have to decide, well, I mean, I don't want to trade too many pieces. Don't really want to allow knight takes f5. I mean, maybe putting the pawn back on f7 was an option. Perhaps immediately attacking the knight on e5 was an option. Something like bishop at f6. Not exactly clear how black should defend. It is chewing up a bit of time on the clock, and generally speaking, the defender does need a bit more time to find the precise moves. I mean, I have a feeling black should be a lot better here, but all it takes is a few little inaccuracies and suddenly white has some serious chances. So assuming pawn at h6, and then Yeah, and I really don't want to take and replace with the pawn because then knight h5 check is coming after the bishop sack on g7. And then I can't step backwards. Well, maybe I can, but the knight on d6 does cover f7. And that was the idea, just to maintain the knight on d6 so the king could always step back to g8 without getting mated on f7. But perhaps it's safer to drop the bishop and allow the trade, just move the bishop back to f6 and try not to trade any more diagonal pieces for doooovid. That's the basic plan, just move the bishop back to f6. If I have a chance to play rook g8, that will be useful. And otherwise, at the right time, trade the knight on e5 and perhaps start running away. King e8, king d7 sort of thing. It's not so clear where I should be dropping the knight in hand and the pawns just yet. So this gives me a chance to drop and win a lot of material after pawn on e2. The trouble is I have to be careful not to allow too much of a counterattack. After the obvious bishop at g7 check, take. I actually thought the move in the game was bishop at h6. But he moved the bishop from c1 to h6, and I was already intending to go back to g8. I mean, it was okay to take the bishop. And I guess he would have gone queen d2 check, and the game goes on. But I think it was perfectly fine to take the bishop, just try and win some more material. So I probably should be taking the rook straight away. And then, yeah, maybe harassing the queen, or just putting the pawn back on e2, I think. Yeah, so I should take the rook and then put the pawn back on e2. I wanted to try and cover some squares. I was thinking about knight at f5 also. I guess this is okay. But now I have a check on e2, so it's a good time to grab all the material. And already I'm looking at all sorts of smothered mate themes with rook at g1 because I have two heavy pieces in hand. But somehow the only thing I looked at was knight h3 check after rook at g1. So there's actually a mate in 4 with rook at g1, king takes, knight e2 check, and somehow I missed knight e2 check. So it was a really bad miss. 7 seconds left. Trying to find a forcing sequence of checks, but I think I've missed the opportunity. Now sacking the queen is very dangerous. Maybe it somehow works out, but I decided to defend with half a second left because it did look like there were some mate threats. It's hard to say exactly though. I think I wasted a piece here. Maybe I should have brought the knight back. I'm just trying to defend against all the threats. There's no time to think. Yeah, he's going to make me sack the queen with knight at h6. So I've totally lost control here. I don't really know what's going on anymore. I don't think this queen sack is actually working because I was intending knight at e2 check, but actually the winning move for doooovid would be just move the king h1, and then I don't have anything. But now, I mean, with so many pieces in hand, there should be a mating sequence. That's a very messy game, very sloppy game from my point of view. Where I had so much material up and I gave it all back and missed the opportunity to mate with the rook at g1 at the right time. But yeah, there we go. 3 knights checkmate. A bit random at the end, a bit of a random finish. And yeah, you can see on the camera I'm not very happy with this performance in the opening game. So with the white pieces, just hear some noise in the background. Can't do much about that. So with the white pieces, I was anticipating e4, e5 with bishop c5, and was looking at what doooovid typically plays with bishop e6, but just decided to play something different because It's an old line which I played maybe 2 or 3 years ago, maybe back to 2017, and if you haven't seen it in a while, because there are many legal moves here for black, there are many possible moves which look okay, but a lot of the moves fail to stuff like knight at f6 check and queen takes h6 ideas. So very easy to go wrong with the black pieces if you're not familiar with this position. So this is the first of two we're going to see like this, and bishop g4 I think is one of the mistakes due to what was played in the game with queen takes h6. Just having a little look at knight at f6 check first, but I think the way I did it is a lot better. So getting a pawn and a bishop for the queen, but with the huge holes you can see on f6 and g7, even though doooovid can put a bishop back on g7, it's going to be too hard to defend after pawn at f6. So I think already white has a decisive advantage. Yeah, just pawn at f6. So he can't make use of the queen in hand. The knights are all defending each other. I don't really need any huge threats here. Just maintain the pressure on f6. Bishop at h4 is what was played in the game. Noticed after the game the computer moved his bishop at d2. But same sort of idea. You just want to sack on h6 and keep dropping stuff on g7 and move the knight back to h5 and so on. Try and make black sack his queen on f6. But yeah, bishop h4 works as well. I think black will have to sack back a queen very soon, no matter what happens. Yeah, and there's just no counterattack in sight. So this one should be in the bag. So yeah, doooovid was saying after the match that he was expecting some of the lines we'd played in arenas with bishop e6, and there's a long line he'd prepared for something, 16 moves deep. But I think in these match formats, these 10-game matches, that surprise is important. So, because if your opponent finds one opening and you get stuck, or you haven't seen it before, or you can't remember, and you have to waste too much time, you need to vary your openings. So that's why, in particular with the black pieces, I'm going to play something different, as you'll see in every game. So a bit of desperation there from doooovid, sacking a bishop on f2. No direct mates by dropping on g7. So I mean, there are many choices. Knight takes f6 looks okay. I thought, yeah, since I'm so safe at the back, why not just grab the material, take on f7. So I'm going to be threatening bishop takes f6 at some point. So that's why he blocks it out with knight at g5, and then, I mean, all trades here should favor white, so might as well just take it and then look for a forcing mate. I think here there are a number of ways to mate. Okay, was calling for knight takes f6, doing it the non-checking. I wanted to find out a way to do it all with checks. Yeah, so looking at knight at g6 check, but couldn't exactly see what to do after king g7, so... And then I saw I had enough diagonal pieces to sack a rook first and draw the king down to h7, and then Finish him off with the bishops. Yeah, and there was also knight at f5 or knight at e6 check in case I ran out of diagonal pieces. So there we go, that's 2-0. And you can see our history is 9-1 in my favor. But yeah, hopefully these statistics don't mean a lot because I've actually got a very bad record against my third round opponent, which we'll come to later. So this opening reminds me a little bit of Bug from Fix. He also plays on chess.com on another handle. But yeah, leaving the knight on c3, playing moves like bishop c4, just trying to sack early in Bughouse on f7. I wasn't quite sure. I haven't seen this move in Crazyhouse, bishop c4. In hindsight, I probably should grab the knight on c3, expecting knight f3 in response, take a pawn, and then drop the pawn straight back on d5. Knight c6 is okay, but it does run into this knight f3, where it looks like black is forced then to play e6. e6 is generally not what you want to do when you have to take back with the g-pawn on f6. But on the other hand, the white bishop on c4 isn't really placed that well after e6, so perhaps I could argue that white hasn't arranged these pieces in the best possible way after e takes and g takes on f6. But probably white is a little better here. But that's hardly unexpected in the opening. So yeah, just expecting e takes f6, g takes. I'm going to bring the rook to g8, trying to make him, well, I either play rook g1 or knight at g3 and keep the knight there. Wasn't sure about this knight b5 move. I think perhaps it would have been better to either play knight e4 or knight e2 to f4. Because I can play a6 at any time. And then he's going to have to sack the knight because he really doesn't want to bring the knight so far out of play on a3. So I'm actually not too unhappy with the way this has turned out. Doooovid goes into the tank a bit here because he obviously doesn't want to play knight a3. I mean, I can just leave it there, or I can even trade and put the knight back straight away on f4. Black is quite solid. As I said before, the bishop on c4 is not that well placed at the moment. Another choice, I guess, is just to ignore it completely and go d3. Maybe even bring the knight back to c3. And then take back with the d-pawn, queen trade. Not entirely sure who that favors. But I'm quite happy with this. So winning all the material back and then have a threat on the bishop on c4. And I really should just play knight at h4 immediately. It's what you do in Bughouse without any hesitation. Knight at h4 is the obvious move, rook g1 and then pawn at h3. I don't know, I think I'm overthinking this and decided to go pawn at h3 first, but it's actually not so effective after just g takes h3 and then if knight at g2 check king f1. Yeah, I can bring the knight back to h4, but I don't yet have a pawn. It's not that easy for me to grab a pawn. And it's not worth sacking a queen at this moment because, yeah, I mean, white would have the move anyway, and there's no forcing mates that I can see. So pawn at h3, yeah, not the most accurate move. Decided to be fancy here again and go knight at f4. Certainly not the obvious move, but I was intending to, after bishop takes, then to go knight at g2 check, so I'd have a diagonal piece in hand. Pawn at e3 is coming. It is the move in the game, and I still was undecided how to respond. I mean, my first thought was knight at g2 check. If king f1, knight takes e3, then pawn at g2 check is coming. So I saw all this, but then I noticed he's got king d2, and even after looking at the game back, after the match had concluded, I'm still not entirely sure what I would have done if I had chosen knight at g2 check and then king d2. So I almost dropped it on g2, and then, as I said, I'm still not sure after king d2 what happens. I guess just bring the queen back somewhere and let him take on f4. Try and claim that the piece sacrifice is worth displacing the king on d2. Yeah, the knights are kind of clunky there, getting in each other's way. So I decided to go bishop b4 check in the hope that it would scare him, because obviously I do want to pick up a pawn at some point for g2. I mean, I thought he probably should play pawn at c3 anyway, and just accept the complications after take bishop d2 and so on. I almost sacked a queen on e3, and then pawn at g2 check to follow. I think it would have been okay, even sacking the queen on b2, because the pawn on g2 is so strong, but decided to set up a trap with e5. It's probably not the best move objectively, but it's kind of a cheap trap with him only having 10 seconds left, because it's a force mate here, whether he blocks take on g2 and then knight at h3, or doing it this way with knight at e2 to finish. So key point there, the knight on g3 is pinned, and it will be mate after queen takes e2, knight takes e2. So, I mean, e5 did give him a chance to sack the bishop on f7. But, I mean, I think bishop takes h3 threat was strong enough anyway to make him seriously worried about grabbing any material. So, well, anyway, that's 3-0. And white again in the fourth game, repeating the same line with bishop takes f6. It seemed to be a big success in game 2 with queen d2. Not the most common move. I think the most common move there would be c3. I'm just aiming to stop any knight d4s, which end up combining well with bishop g4. But black is quite okay in those lines. So we see a new move here, bishop at g5. Don't think I've had this position before. But the themes are always the same. You just want to attack the square f6 with as many pieces as you can, even if it involves a piece sack. I mean, it's too early to play bishop at f6 now, because then after g takes knight at h5, black can drop the bishop back to defend on h8, for instance. But yeah, the idea is just to prepare it with knight at h5 first. Don't really know what I'm thinking about. I suppose the only other thought was to interfere with the queen defending g5. For example, bishop at e7. So looking at knight takes e7, queen takes g5. I didn't really see it working out though. Yeah, knight at h5 is much simpler. Bishop at f6 to follow. So bishop at f6 would be the main threat. And if he defends passively with something like knight at h7, then not entirely sure. Probably just plunge the knight in on g7. Think about what to do. Maybe then I can drop the pawn back on f6, and if he takes, then g5 is hanging with check. Possibly even drop the bishop is more forcing. Anyway, he decides to drop the knight in a slightly more aggressive square and block the queen from attacking g5. So the move that's coming is knight at f4. And if I trade and repeat, I didn't like this too much because then the g-pawn ends up on f4 and then the queen is going to be blocked out for a long time. I'd rather let him move the knight away from f4. So again, the first move I'm thinking of is bishop at f6. There's no real alternative. Well, maybe knight takes g7. Guess the only hesitation was bishop at f6. What happens on knight takes h5? I was trying to calculate if queen takes g5 works. Knight f6, queen f6, queen f6, g f6. Pawn, knight, queen in hand. Something like queen at g6 check. Blocker on g7. Bishop takes f6 check. King h8. Followed by pawn at h6. I don't know. See, he's got a lot of pieces to block with on g7. It's a bit hard to calculate all this. But yeah, it's also possible just to grab the queen after knight takes h5 and don't have to worry about all these messy lines. See, after queen takes g5, he really needs two knights in hand. Whereas if he goes knight takes h5, he only has one for h3 and f3 with checks. So here I'm just having a quick look to see if queen at h7 leads anywhere. So I was looking at king takes f6, queen takes f4 check. He can't go backwards, surely. So he'd have to clear a square with e takes f4, and then knight at d5 check, king e5, queen g7 looks like a mate, but then there's f6, and then the rook guards f6 stopping mate. So, I mean, perhaps there's a mate there somewhere that I missed, but it's a lot simpler just to take the knight on f4 first, because then I don't really have to calculate anything. I know there's a check on e2, but then I also have a knight in hand, so knight at h5. Oh, there was a mate in 3 I missed with queen at h7 check, followed by a knight at g8 check, rook takes and queen takes f7. So it was kind of a cute mate in 3, but anyway, it ended up being something like mate in 5. And yeah, totally no escape. So the critical moment would have happened, yeah, quite a long time ago. Maybe even the fatal mistake was bishop at g5. It's straight out of the opening. I don't think I really allowed my opponent any chances to come back. So this is a funny opening, which I play from time to time with knight h6, allowing the crippling of the pawn structure. It's not a particularly good opening for black. I mean, it's unlikely that white would ever have something prepared specifically against this. Don't really know what opening you call it. So rook g8, well, it doesn't mean I can't castle. I mean, sometimes castling is possible if bishop g7 instead. And then you wait for knight at h5 and then go rook g8. Because then bishop g4 actually hits the knight and makes him waste a bit of time. I don't know, it's a bit of a fancy move order, but the idea of bishop g7 is actually to castle. Another crazy idea to push the h-pawn down the board, h5. Bishop f5 is supposed to be a flexible move because then I can choose to gang up and attack c2 with bishop at e4, like what happened in the game, or if he drops the knight, I could potentially even play e6 and then answer bishop b5 with bishop e7. Seems okay-ish. But how else to defend d5? I suppose I could play bishop at a5 and then pin the knight on c3, take that, stick the knight back on e4. Yeah, it's also a reasonable option. Bishop at e6, I guess. I was actually worried about him pushing pawn to e6, so pushing e5 to e6 at some point, combined with bishop b5. The ideas you might see more commonly in the Caro-Kann in chess. And then trying to make the f-pawn take, and then sticking a knight back on e5, or moving the knight to e5 after bishop b5. So here, not exactly sure. Queen d7 was a choice. Just to slightly solidify the white squares a little more. I was even looking at a rook sack on g2. What else was I looking at? Well, exchanging on d3 I guess is okay. Taking f3 and knight takes d4. I'm not sure how that ends up after a bishop takes f5 and bishop at d7 check. I didn't really want to allow the king to be drawn up to d7, because of course if he gets a knight in hand for c5 it's deadly. Again, I got to watch out for e6 pushes in those sorts of lines. Would have been a lot of action though. Bit of fun playing bishop takes f3 and allowing bishop takes f5. Yeah, rook g4, probably not a good move due to this knight c takes d5. My first thought was just to take the knight and allow bishop takes f5 and then go rook takes f4. And turned out it would have been okay, even though it looks risky to allow pawn at d7 check. Sack the queen, king takes d7. The bishop on d5 actually does a good job to defend. The rook on f4 is then safe. I have quite a few pieces for the queen, and all it takes is a move like rook d8, king e8, and then black is completely safe. So yeah, but in the end I've just allowed doooovid to grab a pawn. My time is running out, so I'm desperate for counterplay. Idea is to take on d5 next, so I'm offering the rook. He could have taken it and just come back to f4. He could have, I don't know, played bishop at c4 or something to follow up with. Queen a5 check, pawn at c3. Do something to defend the light squares, I guess. Pawn at e6 or pawn at d5. The move he did in the game was completely unexpected. I'm not sure whether it was doooovid's best move, objectively best move. Knight takes e7. Very interesting move to follow up with pawn at f6. And I really should move my queen to safety on a square like d7 after pawn at f6. And then I can think about counter-attacking with pawn at c2, like what happened in the game. Yeah, this check is not so good. I mean, the bishop on c3 is purely a defensive piece at the moment. That was my idea, but yeah, once he gets rid of the rook, pawn at g7 is going to be very nasty. So desperate to counterattack here, and I thought maybe he would do best to leave the pawn and play something like queen d2, because now it's a very double-edged. I got ideas of coming in with pawn h3 and dislodging the king to f1, like what happened in the game. It's a little bit unclear. I mean, maybe there's a pawn at d7 check, and I would end up taking with the king, because I want to keep the bishop lined up on d3. I think this is the best way, and then just follow up immediately with pawn h3. If he moves the knight, I don't have to play bishop at g2. I could try and take a pawn. Perhaps knight takes b2 is an option. But yeah, as GSVC pointed out in the game, knight at f4 is much better. Because in that way, I keep the knight on d3, stopping king e1 as an escape. And it should have been a forced mate. But here I let the king come to d2 and then the knights are... Again, kind of useless. They're getting in each other's way. It just takes too many moves. In the meantime, white is attacking the pawn at g7. I have to castle just to defend the king. Otherwise, it's very scary to allow g takes f8 equals queen. So I'm doing all the right defensive moves. I just need to move the rook and play rook e8. And then black is okay. Because white needs a heavy piece to attack. But yeah, fatal mistake. Allowing all these promotions. Rook takes b8 check. Have to give the queen. And yeah, again, because the knights are in the way. If I could keep both the knights on the board, then perhaps I have a chance to force a mate here. But nah, he's just going to get away and grab all the material. I've only got a couple more checks. I mean, it was closer than I thought after king takes and then pawn at g5. I guess he could have even sacked the queen because it's not a real queen. It's only a fake queen. But yeah, no more checks. So we'll play doooovid. He's going to mate with pawn at e7 and yeah, start dropping all the queens on the board. So 3 queens versus 0. Looks like a total one-sided game in the end, but yeah, I was only a pawn short to mate. And if I had found knight at f4 check instead of knight to f4, I thought I was being clever by saving a knight, but yeah, it would have enclosed the king in a net with a lot greater effectiveness than allowing him to escape over to d2. So the scoreline is now 4-1, and we're going for the same opening again. So my thinking is, well, he's the one that's got to find something better. He can't just keep repeating the same lines again. So I haven't been tested too much with the white pieces yet. So king h8. And there's a few cases where you can play this before h6 or after h6 or after h6 and bishop g4, and they're all a little bit different. And yeah, I really don't remember a lot. It's either move the bishop back or play knight g5 or try and grab a pawn with bishop takes c7. So if he really wants to go crazy, he could go bishop h3 and just go all in for the attack and threaten knight at e2 check. And that's in case the bishop takes c7. I'm not sure what other moves are there apart from knight g5 or bishop g5. No other move seems to make a lot of sense to me. King h1 prophylaxis. I mean, he'll just take the bishop on d8, so there's no need. I mean, in general, you don't want to play king h1 when there's a bishop bearing down on the square h3, especially when he can take a diagonal piece. So I think bishop g5 is the most natural move, and trying to get rid of one of his attacking pieces on f4. Okay, knight at e2 check, king h1. I noticed after the game some people were calling for bishop h3 in the chat, but then Variant Sony was saying GSVC was mixing it up with Bughouse, because after g takes h3 then. Yeah, we call that sack sitting. Just waiting for a pawn, which is not going to materialize. Bishop takes f2 as a pawn, but then rook covers the square g2 anyway. So bishop g4. If I had this position again, I'd probably just move the knight out of the way, knight h4. And the only reason I didn't play knight h4 in the game is I couldn't actually see how the knight was attacking. Because it takes a few moves, knight h4, knight f5. I thought if I move the knight to f5, he can then sack the knight on g2, and then I don't know. It turns out to be more of a defensive move and just avoiding trades. But knight h4 is a good move. Nothing wrong with this at all. The thought was, should I drop the queen on h4? But I think the move in the game, which might surprise you if you haven't seen it, and the idea behind it is quite okay. Yeah, so I almost played knight h4. Again, nothing wrong with it, but going for the immediate attack with queen takes e2, so sacking the queen back. We're back to even material, and the whole idea is to play knight at h6. So threatening the bishop on g4, also setting up a smothered mate. And if he goes g takes h6, I wasn't sure whether to take it back or whether to throw in a check on f6. Both seem okay. I could have just taken the bishop on g4, gone for the material, nothing wrong with this either, but I thought knight h4 was more forcing. And then I'd end up with two queens in hand, assuming he's going to sack. So the bishop on g5 is immune due to the queen at g8 smothered mate. If queen h5 instead, then I'll probably just grab the bishop on g4. Alright, so he sacked the queen back for two pieces. And before he starts defending with bishop at f6 or bishop at g7, I think it's quite important to sack one of the queens back, because otherwise, I'll let him get set up with his defense, and it's going to be a very long game, to say the least. I don't want to play a long game with 10 seconds left. So it's a good idea, bishop at f3. He can't take it because of knight to f5 and queen at g7, and that will be a mating net. So he's probably going to drop the queen on somewhere, queen g5, take the bishop. If queen takes h4, there's grabbing another piece back on e2, and then threatening knight at f5 check. So, yeah. His best move here is probably just to sack the queen back, and queen takes f5, e takes, drop the bishop somewhere for defense. And again, yeah, it's still going to be a long game because there's no immediate mates. I mean, white has a material edge, but the game goes on. This is like a little better version of that, because he doesn't want to take the piece back with his king on g7. At the very least, I would have queen at g4 check, picking up the knight on e2. I'm not sure if there's anything better. Okay, so getting the knight out of the way. I can tell doooovid must be desperate for counterplay, so he's going to go rook g8 and rook g2, but it should not be anything to worry about. Just don't take the rook and defend with the queen. And because the rook is the main defensive piece here, defending the g7 square, I just want to sack the queen for the rook. So if he drops a knight on f4, moves a knight to f4, doesn't matter. I'll play queen takes g2 anyway. And should be a mate in a few. Queen at f6 and bishop at e6 to finish. Alright, so that brings us to 5 games to 1. And one more will decide the match. So again, for the 4th time, I'm throwing in a new opening with e4, e5 and bishop e7. I go for the pawn sack line with d5, giving white the choice which way to take. Knight at c6 is the theoretical move. Take the bishop d7. Now black has a choice to go queen takes or knight takes. Both quite interesting. I prefer queen takes d7. I used to play knight takes, well, with both colors actually. Now, if bishop takes c6, I think black should castle immediately, because otherwise bishop takes d7 check. You don't want to let the king be drawn out. And it may look like pawn at h6, white is getting in first with the attack, but something like bishop at d4 will cover the threats and also set up a potential bishop takes f2 check at the same time. So knight at h4, very typical way to attack. The other choices were bishop at d4. Knight at d4 I wasn't so keen on. I thought he might just castle. Alright, so rook at g3 does threaten the immediate counter sack, so I have to drop the bishop to defend g7. I think this is the most accurate move because it also threatens simply bishop takes g3 and then removing the defender of the pawn on g2. But it also sets up a sequence of checks and captures, which should be obvious because there are not many checks and captures in the position. I think the move order doesn't matter too much. But yeah, bishop takes c3, knight takes g2, knight at f3 check is the idea. I think any other move is just allowing white to get safe, and white's eventually going to take over the initiative and keep the extra material. So going in for the sack. I'm actually sacking two knights here because I'm going to end up playing knight at d4 check. And hadn't calculated anything beyond knight at d4, c takes, knight takes. I know I'm going to drop the queen somewhere, but certainly had not worked out a forced mate. The only hesitation here was knight at b2 check, but king e2, and yeah, it's a waste of a knight on b2, so this is much better. So of course the king can't go back because the queen drop on e2 and then knight f3 will finish, so the king has to come up. Possibly king d3 was slightly more accurate, I'm not quite sure, because in the game I'm going to play queen at f3 check. After king e3, queen at f3 check. I mean, I'm going to look at other moves like knight takes c2 check, queen at e2 check, just to see if there is some mating sequence, but I couldn't find it. And I thought the idea of king d3 as a slight improvement was that if I do go queen at f3 check, he can then defend the rook with knight at e3. So in case I want to switch plans and not go for the mate, but just take some material back, like queen takes g2 and defend the g file. So I'm not sure after king d3 were there any better options than queen at f3 check. Yeah, hard to say. But here it's pretty clear I don't have a lot of alternatives. He can't go back again because of bishop b4 check and queen e2 mate. So he's forced to come up and swallow the knight. So I've sacked, what, 2 pieces and 2 pawns, but I can take back the rook straight away. Almost play bishop c5 check, but yeah, it really doesn't go anywhere. So just take back the rook and try and set up some bishop c5 and rook at b4 and pawn at d4 sort of things. Possibly with a queen takes f2 check. But the most important thing, I'm stopping any knight at h6 check counterattacks. So he's moved bishop e3, defends h1, also stops queen takes f2 check. So I decided that's an important piece to get rid of. So just take the bishop on e3. Yeah, almost pawn at d4, but wasn't necessary to give a pawn. Yeah, this intermediate check I don't think changes anything. And what do we have here? I only have a pawn which doesn't belong on c3, because then after king a3 I have no more checks and the bishop kind of gets in the way. So the move here, the best move here is rook takes a8. So the rook's still defending the back row, most importantly picking up a bishop for c3, and then making it very hard for white to defend. I mean, still black is doing quite okay, just picking up a bit more material. Keeping the option open to take on a8 or bishop d4 check, or pawn a3 check and bishop c5. So this sneaky attack threatening queen at g8 and a smothered mate, but if I can get rid of one of the knights, it will ruin the mating net. So leaving the option open to give another check. Queen d2 would have probably led to a quicker mate than in the game. But I missed that chance because queen e2, of course, he can block. But just picking up another knight for c5. There really should be a mate here after a6. And the rook is going to drop somewhere. Otherwise, I can take another piece on g5. So it kind of looks like I'm going for a draw repeating the moves, but now there's a hole on b6. So if he goes back, then rook at b6 and then bishop d6 to finish. Is the mate. That was the game that decided the match, 6-1. And I'm just going to ask if he wants to play some more, because yeah, we can play another 3 games for fun or whatever he wants. And he's making some comments in the chat about me playing openings which don't follow his preparation, like I was talking about before with bishop e6. Maybe he's inviting me to show him what he prepared, but I'm not really so interested in what my opponent's prepared. It's always good to have a few different strings to your bow, a few poison arrows as well. Throw in some unexpected or surprise openings, with both colours. I mean, apart from the main lines, there's quite a lot of openings that are playable, especially with the white side. You often see Jasugi play quietly with d3 and c3 and queen e2, and avoiding castling, avoiding early trades. It's perfectly playable. But for me, I don't know. I like short games, so just try and blow the opponent off the board with some heavy artillery as soon as possible. Oh, he's chatting a bit, that's why he's taking his time here. I'm going to be the first to vary. Throw in the old knight g5 instead. And I think theoretically this is just as good as bishop g5, if not better. Knight d4, yeah, because I've never played this knight g5 before. I'm already thinking on move 7, move 8. But nah, I don't want to sack anything yet. I just play bishop e3 and trade off a knight and then wait for the right time to sack on f7. Yeah, so already black has a very tough choice because it's actually getting quite hard to improve the position without making weaknesses. And queen e7 looks okay, but it's going to run into knight d5 or bishop takes and knight at f5. Bishop e6 looks like I can trade some pieces and win the pawn, so I just go for bishop takes d4 first. If he takes on c4, then he's actually giving up a whole piece. Because, yeah, the way we do it in the game, I get 3 pieces, he gets 2. We can trade queens, but that's okay with me. The knight on g5 does a good job to defend everything. Yeah, and with only bishops in hand, there's not a lot he can do. So yeah, I'm quite happy with the queen trade. Bishop at d4, maybe trying to sack on f2 or pick up the knight, but yeah, as long as I put a piece on somewhere, doesn't make a huge difference where. Bishop at h4, bishop at g3, knight at f5, they all seem good. Bishop at d5 even. Oh, actually, no, not bishop at d5. Because the knight on g5 is hanging. So yeah, this looks good. And threaten bishop at e7. So my opponents decided to call it a day. And yeah, I mean, he can play on with bishop at g4. That's about the best he can do. And maybe we'll end up trading queens. But the final score in the match is going to be a 7-1. In fact, doooovid resigns the 8th game here. And he's had enough. So, fair enough. Thanks for the games, doooovid. Good luck in your next match, because remember, it is a double elimination. Nobody's knocked out after just losing once. And my next opponent is going to be doooovid. And actually have quite a bad record. It's something like 3 wins, 8 losses. But a match situation is always different. You can't always rely on such a small sample of games, but always a tough opponent. He's a d4 player, and I got to be on my best game, because I imagine there'll be some time scrambles against doooovid. And yeah, something I have to try and avoid. Anyway, that's it for round 2. See you again in round 3. Thanks everybody for watching. Yeah, see you next time.